great to be able to blame someone.
A typical hockey enforcer might survive a grueling 10-year career. Derek Boogaard, however, burned out after just 6 brutal seasons, standing an imposing 6'7" and weighing a staggering 265 pounds. They called him the Boogeyman. The professional leagues were constantly hunting for a gladiator, someone desperate enough to absolutely shatter their own body just to secure a spot on a coveted roster. Boogaard possessed an unimaginably massive wingspan that made him a complete nightmare for any opponent to deal with. He evolved into one of the most terrifying heavy-hitting brawlers in the entire sport. Yet absolutely no one bothered to track the immense physical and mental toll it was extracting from him. It would be easy to point the finger and blame one specific person. But the tragic truth is, Derek wasn't naturally wired for unhinged violence. He was systematically molded into a ruthless brawler. And once you truly grasp the dark reasons behind that transformation, every single tragic event that followed begins to make perfect chilling sense. And if this kind of deep dive untold sports story hits different for you, smash that like button right now and subscribe to the channel so you never miss one. Trust me, you are going to want to stick around for this one. Growing up as the son of a Canadian police officer in a remote, dust-blown town in Saskatchewan, Derek's childhood involved constantly uprooting his life, bouncing from one tiny community to another every couple of years, whenever his father's law enforcement assignments shifted. As a young kid, he was incredibly bashful, constantly battling severe reading difficulties in the classroom. And he dealt with what his own father would eventually describe as serious cognitive and behavioral hurdles, especially when it came to controlling his sudden impulses. At his core, he was just a remarkably gentle giant, known by those who loved him for being astonishingly quiet and possessing a wonderfully laid-back demeanor. However, the school system failed him miserably. One particularly unsympathetic elementary teacher made a harsh habit of locking him inside a dark storage closet whenever he acted out or disturbed the class. By the time he hit 9th grade, his academic average was barely hovering around 65%. Then a massive agonizing physical growth spurt took hold of his body. At just 15 years old, Derek had already exploded to a towering 6'4", carrying a solid 210 pounds of pure bulk. This lightning-fast physical expansion left him battling relentless excruciating knee pain and transformed him into a colossus who completely dwarfed every single one of his peers. Outraged parents constantly complained that he was far too large to safely share the ice with kids his own age, while his classmates mercilessly bullied him simply for being a freakishly big kid with a cop for a dad. Whenever schoolyard brawls inevitably found their way to him, he would shut them down with overwhelming decisive force. Even though those closest to him adamantly swore that he never once went out looking for a scrap, always preferring peace over conflict. The ultimate turning point of his entire life occurred during a disastrous Melfort Mustangs game, where his squad was getting absolutely demolished on the scoreboard. Something inside the teenager simply snapped. He leaped straight into the opposing team's bench and furiously attempted to take on half their roster all by himself. His father, watching the chaos unfold from the bleachers, was left completely speechless. He had never witnessed his boy display that kind of raw, unhinged aggression. After being tossed from the arena, Derek took a seat right next to his dad. Out of nowhere, talent scouts for the Regina Pats of the Western Hockey League walked right up to them. Surprisingly, these seasoned evaluators didn't care at all about the violent spectacle they had just witnessed. In fact, they were absolutely thrilled by it. They handed him a golden ticket into junior hockey right then and there, marking his very first stepping stone toward the highest level of the sport. But the journey was far from a fairy tale. During his highly anticipated debut game under the Regina Pats banner, Derek actually hesitated and backed down from dropping the gloves. The management team showed zero mercy, instantly punishing his reluctance by bumping him all the way down to a much lower, less prestigious division. Throughout the 1998 to 1999 season, he managed to net a measly 2 goals across 35 games, while simultaneously racking up an eye-watering 166 penalty minutes. Desperate for a genuine chance to play the game he loved, he passionately pleaded with his head coach for a roster spot in an upcoming tournament. His coach flatly rejected him. Completely shattered Derek quit the team on the spot and openly sobbed during the entire grueling 8-hour car ride back home. His mother vividly remembers the heartbreak of asking why her son had to suffer like this, explaining that his only genuine desire was a fair shot to prove his actual athletic abilities to the world. By the time Autumn rolled around, his frame had stretched to a monstrous 6'7". Suddenly, the Regina Pats were eagerly blowing up his phone, begging him to return. Driven by a burning need to secure his spot, he unleashed absolute havoc during training camp, throwing down in 12 separate bare-knuckle brawls against his own teammates across just 4 practice scrimmages. While his old school teachers had only ever seen a troubled kid who couldn't focus, professional hockey scouts looked at that exact same boy and saw an incredibly lethal weapon. The junior league coaching staff didn't mince words or sugarcoat reality. They made it crystal clear that he wasn't wearing a jersey to score goals or make fancy plays. His sole purpose on that ice was to shed blood and enforce order. In this brutal era of the sport, the enforcer's job was to act as a violent bodyguard for the highly paid superstars, policing the rink with fear. Surviving that specific role demanded massive physical dimensions, a terrifying threshold for agonizing pain, and a twisted willingness to absorb staggering amounts of brain-rattling punishment. Derek already possessed the freakish towering frame. He forced himself to develop all those other gruesome traits through endless sickening repetition and shattered knuckles. He eventually packed his bags and transferred to the Prince George Cougars, where he took a brutal beating in his very first heavyweight clash against Derek Boogaard, a man who would also go on to become a notorious pro enforcer. During the grueling 2001 campaign, he laced up his skates for 61 bruising matchups, finding the back of the net just one single time, while dominating the franchise leaderboards with an astonishing 245 penalty minutes. A league-wide survey even crowned him the most terrifyingly tough player in the entire Western Conference. Late at night, after the stadium lights went dark, he would dial his family's number. His mother could always hear the deep-seated anxiety trembling in his voice, closely shadowed by an unbreakable, stubborn resolve. He was systematically piecing together a brutal professional resume that was written entirely in shattered hand bones and severe, completely undocumented traumatic brain injuries that the medical staff conveniently chose to ignore. When the high-stakes 2001 draft finally arrived, the Minnesota Wild called his name deep into the 7th round. Taken 202nd overall, the small-town kid had technically achieved his wildest dream, but the corporate machine of the league had a profoundly sinister, life-threatening bargain waiting for him in the shadows. Trading your own blood for a roster spot. For 6 brutal years, Derek Boogaard went out on the ice and did exactly what the franchise demanded of him. The crowds would absolutely lose their minds in the stands, completely unaware that inside his own skin, his physical and mental health were rapidly deteriorating. His journey into the National Hockey League officially began with the Minnesota Wild on October 5th, 2005. It took less than 14 days for him to check off the rookie trifecta, logging his inaugural assist, dropping the gloves for his first heavyweight bout, and bearing his very first goal. Head coach Jacques Lemaire immediately recognized the sheer terror this towering giant instilled in opposing lineups, cementing his permanent place on the team's bench. If you just glance at the official stat sheet, you only get a fraction of the story. 277 games played, a mere 3 goals scored, a staggering 589 penalty minutes, and 69 sanctioned brawls. But what happened off camera was infinitely darker, with hundreds of bare-knuckle blows absorbed during closed-door practices and grueling training camps. Those were the silent off-the-record hits to the skull that never once found their way onto the organization's official medical paperwork. Everything escalated on October 27, 2006, when the young enforcer delivered a devastating right hook that put the entire league on notice. Opposing tough guy Todd Fedoruk had been hunting him all over the rink, relentlessly grabbing at his sweater and trying to goad him into a fight. Exactly 7 seconds after their gloves hit the ice, a colossal strike completely obliterated Fedoruk's facial structure. Medical specialists had to literally reconstruct the entire right half of his face, using titanium plates and wire mesh, an absolute nightmare the battered player would later recount to the press. He confessed that he was caught completely off balance, and that incoming haymaker was unquestionably the hardest he had ever been hit in his entire life. Though he somehow managed to stay conscious, his legs instantly gave out, sending his body crumpling lifelessly down to the frozen surface. Even Georges Laraque, a legend widely feared as the most terrifying heavyweight in the sport's modern era, eventually confessed that walking away from the game was largely motivated by a desire to avoid Boogaard, admitting he knew it was only a matter of time before the younger giant completely destroyed him. He bluntly stated he valued his own face way too much to let it get permanently rearranged. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, a constant sickening pounding in Boogaard's skull had begun to take hold. That throbbing pain was swiftly followed by severe cognitive decline, with locker room teammates catching him drawing a blank on basic tactical drills they had executed well over 100 times. Things deteriorated to the point where he resorted to scribbling desperate little reminders on scraps of paper just to get through his basic morning routine. The franchise's front office actively concealed his severe brain trauma, officially documenting his traumatic head injuries as vague upper body shoulder or lumbar issues to keep the press at bay. Despite the horrifying reality that his protective helmet could no longer fit over the massive swelling covering his skull, the league had absolutely zero safety measures in place to stop him from lacing up his skates. Whenever a massive collision caused him to temporarily black out, he would simply shake off the cobwebs and push right through the remainder of his shift. A close confidant eventually revealed that a brain specialist tried to get the enforcer to estimate how many times he had seen stars out on the ice. When the doctor suggested maybe 4 or 5 instances, the hockey star just let out a dark chuckle, telling the medical professional to try multiplying that number into the hundreds. Yet the most devastating and permanent destruction wasn't happening in front of the roaring crowds. It was quietly unfolding right inside the supposedly safe confines of the athletic trainer's clinic. Following these bare-knuckle brawls, his knuckles would balloon up to twice their size. His skin was constantly painted in black and blue, and his spine was in absolute agony, eventually leading to a near-complete loss of basic motor function. He couldn't even control his own fingers properly anymore, an alarming neurological symptom that was completely swept under the rug, much like the chronic brain trauma he was battling. Right here, I want to stop and ask you something important. Do you believe the NHL and professional sports leagues in general are doing enough today to protect their athletes? Drop your honest take in the comments below. I want to hear from you. To keep him on the ice, the team physicians casually handed out heavy-duty narcotics like candy, loading him up on powerful prescriptions including Vicodin, Percocet, and OxyContin. Right in the middle of the 2007 to 2008 campaign, the enforcer approached his former rival Fedoruk to quietly ask about these extremely potent medications. Fedoruk was all too familiar with that dark road, having spent an agonizing 10 years fighting his own horrific demons with chemical dependency. He recalled his fellow tough guy casually mentioning how incredibly effective the dosage was, dangerously probing for details on using the narcotics just to catch a recreational high off the clock. The veteran's warning was direct: tread extremely lightly. Unfortunately, a mere 2 years down the line, that recreational curiosity had morphed into a full-blown crisis, landing the Minnesota forward in a professional rehabilitation facility. Fast forward to 2010, and he finally signed the massive blockbuster deal he had been chasing his entire career, officially joining the iconic New York Rangers. It was a 4-year agreement worth a staggering $6.5 million. Yet this tremendous financial victory arrived way too late to save him from his downward spiral. When he showed up for the Rangers' preseason evaluation, he tipped the scales at a massive 300 pounds, a solid 40 pounds heavier than his official playing weight. The Manhattan front office was legitimately terrified that he had lost his menacing edge, fearing he might suffer a catastrophic life-altering injury if he tangled with other heavyweights in his current physical state. However, it only took a handful of weeks for the hulking enforcer to silence every single one of his critics. He miraculously managed to find the back of the net for the first time since his debut year, shattering a ridiculous 234 game scoring drought, all while thoroughly dominating opponents in center ice brawls. The die-hard supporters were literally screaming his name from the rafters of Madison Square Garden. But that glorious comeback was just a fleeting illusion before everything completely fell apart. Right around the start of November, he dismantled the Edmonton Oilers enforcer Steve McIntyre in a deeply brutal fistfight. But when the two squared up for round 2 later in that very same game, a vicious strike completely shattered his nasal cavity, almost certainly delivering yet another undiagnosed major concussion. Despite sporting a horribly fractured face that hadn't even begun to heal properly, the team sent him right back out onto the ice against the Ottawa Senators on December 9th. Senators enforcer Matt Karkner landed the opening blow, but instead of firing back with his trademark fury, the battered giant simply grabbed onto his opponent's jersey and turned his head away in defeat. Karkner would later recall that deeply unsettling moment, noting that the most feared man in the entire sport simply shut down and gave up right in the middle of the brawl. That final devastating blow to the head didn't just sideline him for the rest of the calendar year. It effectively slammed the door shut on his entire professional hockey journey forever. At just 28 years of age, his body was already giving out. He had suited up for a mere 22 games with the New York Rangers before everything started to unravel. The terrifying gladiator persona the NHL had so carefully crafted for him was completely stripped away, and the brass upstairs had absolutely zero backup plan for his life after hockey. The brutal reality of the sport, the moment a heavyweight enforcer can no longer drop the gloves and throw punches, they faded to complete invisibility. Isolated and suffering, Derek locked himself away inside his Minneapolis apartment, battling through the agonizing daily hell of severe post-concussion syndrome. The Rangers front office strictly instructed him to stay far away from the ice rink, knowing perfectly well that merely looking at the bright lights and motion of the practice facility was enough to trigger crippling bouts of nausea. To save face and keep him cared for, the organization arranged for nutritious meals to be delivered right to his doorstep every single day. But Derek would toss those healthy meals straight into the garbage, opting instead for piles of greasy fast food. He spent the vast majority of his time completely checked out, sleeping through entire days just to escape the relentless pain. Desperate messages pouring in from his worried family were met with total silence. Even the close friends who used to swing by his place eventually drifted away and stopped showing up entirely. Instead of getting proper help, once a week he would make the long, quiet drive out to Long Island, handing over thousands of dollars in cash to a shady dealer in exchange for a massive stash of illicit prescription painkillers. When his concerned father finally made the trip down to visit him that January, he walked into a waking nightmare and discovered that his son was somehow still being handed heavy narcotic prescriptions directly from team doctors, completely ignoring Derek's well-documented and highly dangerous history with substance abuse. Breaking down under the immense weight of it all, Derek wept uncontrollably in his father's arms on multiple occasions. Realizing the severity of the crisis, the Rangers hastily shipped him off to an upscale rehabilitation center in California. But the change of scenery did not save him. He routinely skipped his mandatory recovery meetings and walked away from his crucial psychological therapy sessions entirely, blowing through an astonishing $32,000 in just 2 short weeks, including dropping a cool $5,000 just to rent a luxury Porsche. Things hit rock bottom during a team practice that April. He showed up so incredibly intoxicated that he could not keep his balance on his own skates, crashing hard to the frozen surface over and over again in front of the entire roster. By the time May rolled around, facility directors inexplicably granted Derek a temporary pass to leave the California Rehab Center so he could attend his sister's college graduation. He boarded a flight back to Minneapolis alongside his loyal brother Aaron. On the 11th of May, he officially stepped away from the West Coast treatment facility. The very next morning, caught in a tragic lapse of judgment, Aaron handed his brother a single solitary oxycodone pill. Fueling the fire, Derek hit the town hard, bouncing from bar to bar and drinking heavily throughout the city's bustling warehouse districts. Exactly 2 days later, Aaron tried calling but got no response. When he finally forced his way through the front door of that silent apartment, he found the horrifying truth. The legendary Derek Boogaard had passed away. But the tragedy of Derek's death was absolutely not the final chapter of this dark saga. It was merely the dawn of a massive league-wide reckoning. As one former teammate reflected, dropping the gloves on the ice was never something he dreamed of doing as a kid, but it eventually became a gritty aspect of the game he truly embraced. And he openly admitted he never would have found the courage to step up as a fighter if Derek had not been there to show him the ropes. In a desperate search for answers, the grieving Boogaard family made the agonizing decision to donate Derek's brain to the Boston University Center for the Study of Traumatic Encephalopathy. Months later, on the 6th of December 2011, renowned neuropathologist Dr. Ann McKee stepped up to the microphone and officially revealed her devastating findings to the world. The brutal diagnosis was confirmed without a shadow of a doubt. Derek was suffering from chronic traumatic encephalopathy, widely known as CTE. It was not just the mere presence of the disease that left the researchers completely speechless. It was the sheer terrifying severity of the internal brain damage. When Dr. McKee analyzed the fragile brain tissue under her powerful microscope, she uncovered massive dark deposits of toxic tau proteins, violently spreading throughout his cerebral cortex. These were the exact same sinister tangled protein clusters, typically discovered in elderly patients suffering from the absolute final stages of advanced Alzheimer's disease. The catastrophic neurological damage inside his skull was leaps and bounds more advanced than virtually any other young professional athlete Dr. McKee had ever analyzed in her entire career. Staring face to face with that unprecedented level of deterioration, she later confessed to the press that it was an absolute jaw-dropping moment of sheer disbelief. The chilling truth was finally out in the open. The beloved enforcer Derek Boogaard had been slowly, painfully dying right in front of packed arenas for years. And yet all of us sitting in the stands, cheering for the bloodshed, just brushed it off and called it old school American hockey. The curse did not stop there. Within a devastatingly short span of just 4 months following Derek's fatal overdose, 2 more prominent hockey enforcers would tragically lose their lives. On the 15th of August 2011, 27-year-old tough guy Rick Rypien was discovered lifeless inside his quiet home in Alberta. The official cause of death was ruled a heartbreaking suicide. Behind closed doors, Rypien had been quietly waging a brutal war against clinical depression for the better part of a decade, even taking an extended personal leave of absence from the Vancouver Canucks organization, just to try and save his own mind. A mere 16 days after that devastating loss, on the 31st of August, tragedy struck the hockey community yet again. Fan favorite enforcer Wade Balak was discovered dead inside a downtown Toronto hotel room. He was only 35 years old and had just recently retired after a grueling 14-year career in the big leagues. While the sports media immediately rushed to label his sudden passing as yet another suicide, his grieving family would later come forward, adamantly maintaining that the fatal incident was entirely accidental. But the warning signs had been flashing for a long time. Balak's devoted wife Jennifer had started noticing dark, unsettling changes in her husband's behavior, at least 5 full years before his tragic end. The once larger-than-life personality completely faded away. He became incredibly introverted and eerily silent around the house, developing a severe sensitivity where he absolutely could not handle everyday background noise. Worst of all, his cognitive function and memory rapidly deteriorated to such a terrifying extreme that he had to resort to snapping photographs of the groceries he needed, just so he would not forget what to buy at the store. In the shadowy aftermath of these profound losses, the shattered families of the fallen players slowly started to find each other, connecting through their shared grief. These critical, heartbreaking conversations took place in total secrecy, kept strictly behind closed doors, and far away from the prying cameras of the relentless sports media. Word began to spread through the locker rooms, and several active enforcers reportedly started reaching out to one another in private, terrified and desperate to discuss the identical debilitating mental symptoms they were secretly experiencing. They whispered about the blinding headaches, the terrifying memory blackouts, and the crushing, suffocating depression. But absolutely no one dared to step into the spotlight and expose the truth, because surviving as a gladiator on the ice meant strictly adhering to the unspoken rule you always had to look invincible. In this brutal league, showing even a fraction of vulnerability was a one-way ticket off the roster and out of the game entirely. The tragedy deepened when veteran defenseman Steve Montador passed away in 2015 at just 35 years old, and a post-mortem examination revealed his brain was also ravaged by chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Seeking justice and accountability, the devastated Boogaard family filed a massive wrongful death lawsuit against the National Hockey League in May of 2013. During the intense legal proceedings, their attorneys unearthed a horrifying truth. Derek had been handed no fewer than 11 separate medication prescriptions, written by 8 distinct medical professionals, all within a single solitary season playing for the Minnesota Wild. Following a painful incident that left him with a shattered tooth while suiting up for the New York Rangers, the situation spiraled completely out of control. The franchise's medical staff authorized a staggering 17 different prescriptions, flooding his battered system with an unbelievable 366 highly addictive pills. Just a handful of agonizing months before he tragically passed away, his dad traveled out to New York City to spend time with his son. It became horrifyingly apparent that Derek was actively receiving fresh drug supplies directly from the team's medical personnel, completely disregarding his widely known battles with severe dependency and his recent stints in rehabilitation facilities. The scathing legal documents went so far as to claim that team officials actually tipped the enforcer off, giving him a full 4 days of advance warning before administering his upcoming mandatory substance screening. The hockey world was shaken to its very core when 3 widely known heavyweights lost their lives in a devastating span of just 4 months. So how did the massive corporate entity running professional hockey react to this crisis? League Commissioner Gary Bettman went on the record telling the press at the New York Times that there simply was not enough concrete scientific evidence available yet, insisting that leading medical professionals felt it was way too early to directly link repetitive head trauma on the ice to massive brain degeneration. The front office stubbornly doubled down, making it absolutely clear they had zero intentions of altering the deeply ingrained on-ice brawling traditions that fans paid to see. However, the public outcry and relentless media scrutiny quickly intensified into an unstoppable avalanche of outrage. Having 3 prominent tough guys die within a span of merely 4 months was a grim reality that could no longer be swept under the rug, forcing the governing bodies to sluggishly begin rewriting their safety protocols. The league finally introduced mandatory head trauma evaluations, mandating that any skater who took a severe blow to the skull had to be pulled from the ice immediately and thoroughly checked by an independent spotter in an isolated, noise-free locker room area. Brutal predatory checks targeting the cranium from a player's blind spot were officially outlawed in the rulebook forever. While it certainly represented a monumental step forward for player safety, grieving advocates and heartbroken fans loudly pointed out that these measures arrived tragically too late to save Derek and his fallen brothers. Retired enforcers who used to make a living throwing bare-knuckle punches on the ice finally started breaking their long-held silence and sharing their harrowing personal stories with the world. Feared heavyweight Georges Laraque confessed during a nationally syndicated radio broadcast that he absolutely despised dropping the gloves, a shocking revelation considering he built an incredibly lucrative professional career doing exactly that. He openly detested the suffocating mental weight of his job, utterly loathed being labeled as a mindless thug or a vicious beast by the media, and was sickened by the fact that his livelihood depended on marketing sheer brutality to the masses. The former gladiator painted a vivid picture of the relentless stomach-churning panic that crept in whenever he realized he was scheduled to square off against a mountain of a man like Derek Boogaard. It was an all-consuming sense of dread that would completely eat away at his sanity the entire night before puck drop, ruining simple moments like watching a film and haunting every single second he spent awake. According to his heartbreaking testimony, a massive percentage of the tough guys scattered around the locker rooms consumed enormous quantities of alcohol strictly as a coping mechanism to numb their absolute terror, signaling that the toxic locker room culture of silence was finally fracturing for good. Franchise general managers gradually began phasing out those one-dimensional heavyweight roster spots, largely because cutting-edge data analysis finally confirmed what smart hockey minds had secretly believed for decades. Having guys punching each other in the face did absolutely nothing to deter cheap shots or protect star players, and it contributed zero mathematical value to actually securing victories on the scoreboard. The business side of the sport rapidly adapted to these hard numbers. Back during Derek's final campaign in the 2010 to 2011 season, officials tallied a staggering 714 separate brawls across the league. Fast forward to modern campaigns, and that violent metric has plummeted drastically to merely 246 altercations, marking a monumental 65% nosedive in bare-knuckle action. The new generation of talent actively started pushing back, flat out rejecting the pressure to act as human punching bags, which fundamentally altered the landscape of what was deemed acceptable in professional locker rooms. The very specific brutal occupation that had cemented Derek's terrifying reputation on the ice was rapidly evaporating into the annals of sports history. Seeking real systemic change, Derek's grieving mother Joanne stood before lawmakers in Washington and delivered powerful congressional testimony regarding the devastating consequences of unregulated athletic violence. His postmortem brain tissue was generously donated to groundbreaking degenerative brain disease research initiatives being conducted by medical experts at Boston University, playing a vital legacy-defining role in massive scientific studies that have since meticulously analyzed the neural pathways of hundreds of broken professional competitors. A dedicated rehabilitation initiative appropriately named in his honor was officially launched to provide a critical lifeline for current roster members desperately battling their own dark demons of chemical dependency. The fresh-faced rookies getting drafted into the major leagues today have grown up in a drastically different era where they have literally never witnessed a classic stage-managed heavyweight brawl on professional ice. The modern iteration of this frozen sport relies entirely on blistering speed, an incredible stick-handling finesse, and has almost entirely shed its vicious blood-soaked past. At the end of the day, all Derek ever truly wanted was a chance to skate and play the game he loved. But the ruthless corporate machine molded him into a terrifying manufactured weapon instead. The real debate going forward shouldn't focus on categorizing him simply as an elite athlete or just a brawler. The burning question is whether this sport is truly prepared to stop churning out disposable gladiators, leaving us to wonder just how many other heartbreaking tragedies identical to his are currently being covered up by front office brass. If this story hit you as hard as it hits me, then do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you never miss these deep dive stories that the mainstream sports media will never dare to tell. Stories like Derek's deserve to be heard. See you in the next one. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep digging into these devastating dark sports tales that absolutely never managed to find their way onto the glitzy nightly Sports Television Center stage.